It was 2:17 a.m. when I first heard it. The unmistakable sound of electricity doing what it does best, frying something. The loud pop echoed across my backyard, followed by a screech that made my blood run cold. It wasn't a usual kind of scream. It was the kind of panic that only comes when someone's world falls apart in an instant. I knew exactly what had happened, and I knew exactly who was responsible. But let me back up a bit. This didn't start with sparks or shrieks. It all began with a subtle dip in my energy usage, something most people would have overlooked. But I wasn't most people. You see, I'm not just some guy who fixes things when they break. I'm an electrical engineer. I spend my days designing systems that power data centers, keeping the lights on for businesses, hospitals, you name it. Power is what I do. It's not just my job, it's my passion. And when my home energy monitor showed a strange drop in power usage late at night, I immediately knew something was off. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was an appliance I hadn't noticed cycling on. But then it started happening every night, between 1 and 3 a.m. Just a small dip, but it was enough to raise an eyebrow. The power drain didn't match anything in my house. No HVAC, no hot tub, nothing that should have been drawing power at those hours. I started paying closer attention. My neighborhood is quiet, almost annoyingly so. It's the kind of place where people have lawns so well kept. They look like golf courses, and the sound of leaf blowers is a staple of weekend mornings. People here love their compost piles, their handcrafted birdhouses, and their DIY fences. No one's looking for drama, but when you spend that much time on your lawn, you start noticing the little things. And I noticed something. At night, when the streets were still, there was this odd drop in my energy consumption. It was subtle but consistent, and that's when I started suspecting something, or rather someone, was draining power from my system. Then one day it hit me. It wasn't just a random anomaly. It was someone across the fence, and I didn't have to look far to figure out who. My next-door neighbor, Karen, had recently gotten herself a new toy, an electric ATV for her son. I'd seen it parked in her yard more than once, a souped-up electric four-wheeler that looked more like a motorized nuisance than a recreational vehicle. It wasn't just loud, it was obnoxious. And it ran on electricity, something I could not ignore. The ATV wasn't just an eyesore, it was the perfect target for my suspicions. The weird part? I saw a cord snaking over my fence, disappearing into the shadows behind my shed. It didn't make sense. I had no outdoor outlets back there, at least not ones that I had set up. And it wasn't just hanging there, abandoned. It was plugged into something. That something? Her ATV charger. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe it was her son, not even realizing what he was doing, thinking the outlet was fair game. But deep down, I knew better. So, I did what any sane person would do in my position. I turned off all my exterior breakers, except one. I wanted to see if this was really happening or if I was imagining things. That night, I kept an eye on the power logs, watching for any changes. Sure enough, the next morning, my monitor showed a dip at exactly 2:12 a.m. It was the same dip I had seen every night. I wasn't just imagining it anymore. Karen had plugged into my power. The next day, I couldn't let it go. I walked over to her house, determined to confront her about it. I wasn't looking for a fight, just some answers. When she opened the door, there she was, looking every bit the picture of entitlement. Yoga pants, a mimosa in hand, and a smile that could only be described as smug. She had that look, the one you get when you know you've done something wrong, but think you can talk your way out of it. I explained the situation calmly. I told her that I had noticed a power drain every night, and that it seemed to be coming from her side of the fence. Maybe it was her son, I said, not realizing that he was using my outlet. Her response? Oh, that? We just needed to charge the ATV while our garage panel is getting fixed. You have solar, right? You probably don't even notice it. I was taken aback. It's no big deal, she said, as though it was just a minor inconvenience to me, as though she wasn't literally siphoning my power without permission. I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my cool. I told her that it wasn't just a small thing. It was theft, no matter how small, and that it was affecting my home energy system. But of course, she didn't take me seriously. She literally patted my arm like I was overreacting, smiled, and said, "Relax, you're such a tech guy. It's not like we're draining your car battery." I stood there, trying to keep my temper in check, but inside, I was seething. This wasn't just about a little power. This was about respect. She hadn't just stolen from me. She had insulted me, my work, my expertise. And at that moment, I knew I wasn't just going to let it slide. I left her house that day, but I wasn't done. I called the HOA, hoping they would take it seriously. I reported the theft, gave them the evidence, and expected them to handle it. What happened next? Well, that's when the real trouble started. 3 days later, I got a letter from the HOA, and it wasn't what I expected. It wasn't a notice that they were addressing the theft or taking action against Karen. No, it was a warning. They said I was creating hostile dynamics and unauthorized modifications to shared structures. Karen had somehow convinced them that I was the one causing trouble. In her version of events, I had somehow become the villain. I couldn't believe it. But I wasn't going to play defense anymore. If Karen wanted to escalate things, fine, I'd be ready. I wasn't about to let this go. Karen thought she could just plug in whenever she felt like it, and I'd be fine with it. She clearly didn't understand the kind of person she was dealing with. I wasn't just some quiet neighbor who kept to himself. I was an electrical engineer with years of experience designing systems for high-stakes environments, not some fool who would let someone walk all over him. So when I got that letter from the HOA, claiming I was the one causing hostile dynamics, I had a decision to make. I could play the game and let them get away with it, or I could go on the offensive. I decided to go with the second option. I wasn't going to sit back and let her turn this into some absurd HOA drama. No, I was going to make sure this got handled. I didn't know it at the time, but Karen had just made one of the biggest mistakes of her life. She didn't just cross me as a neighbor, she crossed me as an engineer. Now I was about to show her exactly how careful you need to be when you mess with someone who knows how to build things. I could have simply gone to the HOA with my complaint and tried to prove that Karen was stealing power. But where's the fun in that? No, I had something much better in mind. I started sketching a plan. It needed to be subtle. It needed to look harmless. And most importantly, it had to be personal. She hadn't just stolen my power. She had insulted my craft, my expertise, my work. She had no idea what I could do if I set my mind to it, and I wasn't about to let her get away with it. I thought long and hard about the best way to handle this. It had to be clever, precise, and something she couldn't ignore. I designed the perfect decoy outlet. I installed it on my side of the fence, hidden just enough to look like I'd abandoned it. It was wired to a tool shed junction, looking like a harmless, unused plug that anyone might overlook. But behind that innocent-looking outlet, there was something far more dangerous. I hooked it up to a circuit designed to do one thing: fry anything that tried to draw too much power. Specifically, it was tuned to fry any charger that tried to pull more than 3 amps. No appliance in my house would ever trip it, but an ATV charger? Absolutely. The plan was simple. I needed to make Karen think she was just getting a quick charge. She wouldn't suspect a thing. But as soon as her son plugged in his ATV charger, everything would go up in smoke, literally. I wasn't just hoping it would work, I knew it would. I designed it myself, and I knew exactly what would happen when the circuit was triggered. It was the perfect trap. It didn't just punish her for stealing power. It would deliver a kind of justice that would make sure she thought twice before ever trying something like this again. But I also had to be patient. The timing was crucial. I had to wait for her to bite. It didn't take long. 3 nights later, the cord was back. I saw it slithering over the fence, just as I'd predicted. I knew it was Karen's son trying to plug in his ATV, trying to take what didn't belong to him. I didn't even need to look out the window. I was already in my workshop watching the logs as they spiked at 2:17 a.m., just like I had planned. I knew this was the moment. The outlet was connected, and the circuit did its job flawlessly. There was a brilliant flash of blue light, followed by a loud pop, and then, music to my ears, a shriek. It was Karen. I could hear her scream from over the fence like her world was falling apart. It was the kind of scream you only hear when someone realizes they've just made a huge mistake. And believe me, this was a mistake she was never going to forget. I wasn't going to rush out and confront her right then, though. No, I savored the moment. I could picture her son, stumbling out in his boxers, trying to figure out why his precious ATV was now smoking like something out of a Halloween special. I could almost hear his panicked yells as the smoke started to billow out of the charger. I felt a strange satisfaction. This wasn't just about power anymore. It was about respect, about making sure she realized she couldn't just take from me and walk away unscathed. I stayed inside, watching from the window, sipping my tea, letting her have her moment of chaos. It was the least she deserved. But that was just the beginning. The next morning, the scene was exactly what I'd expected. Karen was running around in slippers, muttering angrily about sabotage and calling the fire marshal. Her son was probably sulking somewhere in the background, nursing the damage to his precious ATV. But Karen, she was furious. The cord was gone again. The ATV was covered up like a crime scene, and Karen was on the phone, no doubt trying to paint the picture of a dangerous, malicious neighbor who had set a trap for her son. But here's the thing. There was no danger. The outlet had been perfectly safe for any human, animal, or even a squirrel that might have gotten too close. It was a foolproof system. The only thing it had fried was her charger, and that was the least she deserved. Still, I wasn't celebrating yet. That was just the first act. I could hear her ranting through the fence. It was the same old, "you're a bad neighbor" spiel, but this time, I was done being the nice guy. She'd stolen my power, lied about it, and now she was making me the villain. I wasn't about to let her twist the narrative in her favor. I had proof. I had the footage, the logs, and the design to back me up. I wasn't going to sit back and wait for the HOA to screw me over. No, I had something else in mind. I was done playing defense. Karen had no idea that she'd just poked the bear. And now, the bear was about to strike back, with precision and a vengeance. The next move wasn't going to be about simply catching her in the act again. No, I had to outsmart her completely. I had to turn the tables on her and show her that messing with an electrical engineer was a bad idea. But before that, I needed to watch. I needed to make sure she didn't pull the same stunt again. It was time to ramp things up. The neighborhood wouldn't know what hit it. Karen wasn't about to let this slide, not for a second. The morning after the little electrical incident, I woke up to the sound of her stomping around outside, clearly not in the best mood. I had to give it to her. She certainly knew how to make a scene. I could hear her, pacing around in her slippers, throwing angry words at the wind, and I was sure that there was some dramatic monologue happening just on the other side of the fence. It didn't take long before I saw her on the phone again, probably with the fire marshal or someone she could get to side with her. Of course, she was convinced I was some kind of villain in this story. To her, I was the bad guy who'd set up some kind of malicious trap. But it wasn't like that. There was no danger to anyone, least of all her son. But of course she couldn't see that. Her little world was crashing down, and she wasn't going to just take it. I had to laugh to myself as I watched her stomp around, trying to figure out who to blame for her poor choices. Her son's ATV was under a tarp, and the charger was nowhere to be found. I could almost picture her dialing number after number, trying to gather some kind of support, trying to figure out how she could pin this on me. But here's the thing about Karen. She didn't learn from her mistakes. She doubled down. This wasn't a person who would sit quietly and reflect on her wrongs. Oh no, she was the type who would scream louder when caught. So, while I watched her play out her drama, I couldn't help but feel a little bit of satisfaction. She had no idea what was coming next. I didn't want to get involved in another argument right then, though. I wasn't looking to start a confrontation. I had already made my point. But something told me that this wasn't over. Karen would escalate, and the HOA would probably back her up. I had to be prepared for that too. Later that afternoon, just as I was finishing up a project in the garage, I heard a knock at the door. I opened it to find a guy standing there in khakis and a golf shirt, clipboard in hand, the typical HOA guy. He had that look of someone who thought they were about to lay down the law. His expression was smug, like he already had me figured out. "You can't just install unauthorized electrical devices along a shared boundary," he said, before even introducing himself. I recognized that voice. This was exactly the type of person Karen would recruit when things didn't go her way. She had to have called him in to put the pressure on me. I kept my composure. I was prepared for this, after all. "Are you here because of the incident with the outlet?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. He nodded, immediately launching into a lecture about how I had made unauthorized modifications to the property, and that I couldn't just put electrical outlets wherever I felt like it. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't about to get caught up in another HOA back and forth. Instead, I decided to take a different approach. I explained to him that the outlet was actually on my side of the fence, legally installed and wired to code. What he didn't know, what Karen didn't know either, was that I had installed the outlet with a fail-safe system specifically designed to be safe. Safe for humans, pets, and even a confused squirrel who might wander by. But absolutely catastrophic for anything that tried to pull too much power. The whole thing was meticulously designed, and it was a system that only affected high-power chargers like the ATV charger Karen had plugged in. The look on his face when I explained the setup was priceless. He had no idea how to respond to that. He went on quoting some bylaw about how the HOA prohibited modifications to shared structures, but it was clear he didn't really know what he was talking about. He just kept reading off his clipboard like he was trying to find something that would stick. But when I pulled out the footage of Karen's son sneaking across the fence, plugging in the ATV, his whole demeanor shifted. Suddenly, he wasn't so sure of himself. I could tell he was realizing that this wasn't a simple case of a rogue neighbor. I didn't just have the footage of Karen's son plugging in the charger. I had timestamps, power logs, and proof that I had installed everything to code. There was no gray area here, no wiggle room. I had designed the system to be as safe as it could possibly be. But that wasn't the end of it. The HOA guy made a note on his clipboard, said something about further review, and then left without much else to add. I offered him a cookie as he walked out. The strange thing was that I wasn't even worried anymore. Karen was furious, but I knew I had the upper hand. I wasn't going to get in trouble. She might throw a fit, but at this point, I had evidence and facts to back me up. I felt a sense of relief wash over me as I closed the door behind the guy. I had done everything right, and no matter how loud Karen screamed, it wasn't going to change the facts. But the real fun hadn't even started yet. Karen thought she was just going to make a few phone calls and make this go away. She probably figured that by calling in the HOA, she could convince them that I was the problem. But she didn't realize that the HOA wasn't the end-all be-all. She didn't understand that I wasn't going to sit back and let her walk all over me. I had a bigger plan, and soon, the whole neighborhood would know exactly what she'd been up to. It wasn't just about one ATV charger anymore. It was about showing Karen that she couldn't use people's goodwill to power her entire lifestyle. The moment she got the HOA involved, she crossed the line. It was no longer just about one power theft. It was about the principle of the thing. And now, I had the perfect opportunity to turn her mistake into a full-blown neighborhood spectacle. The next step wasn't just about catching her again. No, I was ready to make it clear that this wasn't a one-time thing. Karen was about to find out that sometimes people don't just roll over when you take advantage of them. When the HOA had failed to act, I decided to go bigger. I wasn't going to let this slide. Not now. Not after she'd tried to manipulate the situation and turn me into the bad guy. So I went to the city. I didn't just want her to get a slap on the wrist from the HOA. I wanted the full force of the law. She had to understand that what she did wasn't just petty theft. It was an abuse of power, a violation of basic respect. And when I got the ball rolling, I knew it would only be a matter of time before she realized just how much trouble she'd brought down on herself. What I didn't expect was just how far Karen would take this. You'd think that after the whole ATV incident, she might have learned her lesson. But that's not the type of person Karen is. No, Karen was going to double down, like she always did. She wasn't content with just stealing power from me. No, she had to push it further, escalate it to a level that no one in this quiet neighborhood had ever seen before. And the thing is, when entitled people like Karen feel backed into a corner, they don't just sit down and take the loss. They come out swinging, and I had a feeling I was in for a fight. One evening, a few days after the incident with her son's ATV charger, I got a knock on my door. At first, I figured it was just another round of her trying to get the HOA involved, or maybe even another complaint about my so-called dangerous outlet. But when I opened the door, I was surprised to see a handful of neighbors standing on my front porch, looking more serious than I'd ever seen them. Tom, the guy down the street with the fancy outdoor kitchen, was there, along with Nancy, who usually just waved from her front yard, and the Patel family, who had a small catering business. They didn't look happy. They were concerned. They didn't have to say much for me to realize what was going on. "Have you noticed anything weird with your power?" Tom asked, cutting straight to the point. I looked around at the others, all of them nodding in agreement. Nancy spoke up next. "I don't know how to explain it, but my garden lights, they keep flickering, and sometimes they reset themselves at weird hours. I thought it was just a glitch." The Patel family had a similar story. Their freezer had thawed out a few weeks ago, with no explanation. "We didn't even realize it at first," Mrs. Patel said, "but we started noticing our fridge was losing its cool around the same time." It was all clicking into place for me now. Karen wasn't just stealing from me. She'd been stealing from everyone. I was stunned. The power dips, the strange outages, the unexplained resets of their appliances. It all lined up perfectly. This wasn't an accident. Karen had been running a full-blown power theft operation in the neighborhood, and no one had proof until now. They were all coming to me because they knew I was the guy who could put the pieces together. I was the one who could track down the culprit and put an end to it. I showed them my logs, the ones I had meticulously kept over the past few weeks. Every power dip, every spike in the logs, everything aligned with the times Karen's son had been sneaking over to my fence. They were shocked. Most of them had no idea what was really going on. They had just assumed it was an odd fluke with their appliances. But now it was clear Karen had been plugging into their outlets too. So, we did what any group of fed-up neighbors would do. We organized. We started a group chat, called it Shock by Karen, because, well, it seemed fitting. And before long, it was a community-wide effort. We shared stories, compared notes, and realized just how bad it had gotten. Turns out, Karen wasn't just tapping into her neighbor's power to charge her son's ATV. She had been using it for everything. Freezers, fridges, outdoor lights, even the electric grill in Tom's backyard. It was all coming from us, all of it. She had no shame. I wasn't the only one affected. She had been stealing from half the block. And now that we all had the evidence, it was time to turn the tables. We were no longer just defending ourselves individually. This wasn't about a single outlet or a single theft anymore. This was about reclaiming our community. I helped Tom install a power meter on his outdoor kitchen, and Nancy gave me the go-ahead to put in a decoy cord at her place too. We weren't just trying to catch her in the act. We were going to make sure that when she tried to plug into our power again, we would be ready. We weren't going to let Karen walk all over us anymore. She had overplayed her hand, and now she was going to pay for it. The night of the HOA meeting arrived, and it was unlike any meeting I'd ever attended. The usual topics, patio furniture height, lawn care regulations, were all forgotten. This was going to be a different kind of meeting. As we walked into the clubhouse, I could feel the energy in the air. The other neighbors were talking in hushed voices, passing notes, and getting ready to present their case. The usual sleepy vibe of HOA gatherings was gone. This time, everyone had come to fight for what was right. I wasn't just there to defend myself anymore. I was there for all of us. Karen had messed with the wrong group of people, and now she was going to face the consequences. One by one, we took our turn. Tom went first, explaining how his outdoor kitchen had started losing power at the same time Karen's son had been sneaking across the fence. Nancy followed, talking about the mysterious, flickering garden lights. Then the Patels shared their story about the freezer. We all had our evidence, photos, timestamps, power logs, and then, just as planned, I stood up and handed the HOA president, Greg, a folder with everything. Police reports, power logs, footage of Karen's son sneaking across my yard, and even the documents showing how my setup was completely legal and safe. Karen tried to interrupt, trying to defend herself, but no one was listening anymore. She was cornered. When the evidence came out, it was clear what had been going on. There was no denying it. The HOA could no longer pretend it wasn't a big deal. Greg, who was a longtime ally of Karen, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He tried to save her at first, but the facts spoke louder than anything he could say. The room was filled with neighbors who had suffered in silence for far too long. Even Greg couldn't protect Karen anymore. The board voted to suspend her HOA privileges, and the rest of the meeting was filled with chatter about fines and even a potential restraining order. Karen stormed out, throwing a tantrum, but no one cared. The truth had come out, and she was no longer the queen of the block. But that wasn't the end of the story. Karen thought she could still get away with it. She thought she could still manipulate the situation and twist the truth to make herself the victim. But it was clear now that the neighborhood wasn't going to back down. No one was going to let her get away with the thefts. We all stood together, ready to make sure she didn't walk away from this unscathed. The message was clear. Karen had crossed a line, and the consequences were about to come crashing down on her. She thought she could keep stealing, keep getting away with it. But now she was facing a reckoning, and it wasn't going to be pretty. The neighborhood had finally united, and we weren't going to let Karen push us around anymore. It was time for her to pay for what she had done. And as the meeting came to an end, we all knew this was just the beginning. Karen had made one final mistake. She had underestimated us. Now it was our turn to make sure she never did it again. And when the dust settled, she would have no one to blame but herself.